5, how to solve quadratic equations that are in this form, in standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. It's really important that you get something equal to 0 by completing the square. We only need to do this when we cannot factor. So, for example, example 1, I would like to solve x squared minus 10x plus 1 equals 0. So if I go ahead and try to do my diamond problem, and I say, or I try to write it factored, and I say what multiplies to 1 and adds to negative 10, you can tell right away there's nothing that works. So we're stuck. We don't have any technique to solve for x. And the only way to do this is to rewrite this as a perfect square. And that's why it's called completing the square. To rewrite this as a perfect square and then take the square root. So the steps are, and then we'll go back and solve this. Here are the steps. Number one is move this constant to the other side. In other words, that's basically c. So move constant c to the other side if it's there. That's the first step. 2 is where you complete the square. So you add this, you take half of this and square it and add it to each side. So you add, this is b, you take half of it and then you square it and you add that to each side. It's an equation that needs to stay balanced. So we have to add it to both sides. And finally, you factor. It'll be a perfect square trinomial, and you factor as a perfect square. And then you'll take the square root, or is take the square root. Okay, and so take the square root. Those are the steps. And some of you might be thinking, why not just use the quadratic formula? Well, this is where the quadratic formula comes from. So this actually is using the quadratic formula, it's just using a better understanding of it. And it turns out that the skill of completing the square is useful with other things. So let's go through these steps. So the first thing is we're going to move this constant to the other side by subtracting 1 from each side. So minus 1, minus 1. Then I'm going to draw this little magic box, and I'm going to put a number, which is completing the square, in there. And that number will always be positive. You take half of this, negative 10, half of that is negative 5, and square it. That will always give you a positive number. So plus 25, plus 25. And the equation's still balanced because it's the same. So that's adding b over 2 squared to each side. This I can factor. And in fact, I can factor it as a perfect square. If I go straight to the answer doing the opposite of FOIL, x times x is x squared. 5 times 5 is 25, but I need them both to be negative, so they add to negative 10. These two things will always be the same. I'm just going to add these two constants together. Negative 1 plus 25 is 24. Alright, now this is a perfect square, so you actually want to write it as a perfect square, like that. Because what that allows me to do is take the square root of each side. So I take the square root of that, I take the square root of that, and put a plus or minus. The square root and the square cancel each other out on the left. Here I have plus or minus the square root of 24. And now all I have to do is add 5, and I have what x is. Add 5, plus 5, plus 5. So we get 5 plus or minus the square root of 24. And so our two answers, they're decimals, and that explains why we couldn't factor it in the first place. One answer is 5 plus the square root of 24. The other answer is 5 minus the square root of 24. So let's actually do that on the calculator. equation. If I plug this in for x, I'll get 0, and if I plug that in for x, I will get 0. So that is the first example. I'm going to do one more. So example 2, I'm going to show you one more time. Let's say we have x squared minus 2x minus 7 equals 0. Okay, I'm going to go through the steps. First one, move this constant to the other side by adding 7 to each side. Then I have to pick a number here so that I can factor this as a perfect square. Half of negative 2 is negative 1, squared is 1. So it'll always be a positive number. This, you can factor, it'll always be a perfect square. So it's going to be x minus 1 times x minus 1. And that you can write as a perfect square. And now I take the square root. X minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 8. So I have x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 8. And that's why I couldn't factor it, because it is not an integer. The answers are not integers. So on my calculator, I'm going to do 1 plus the square root of 8, and I'm going to also do 1 minus the square root of 8 to get my two answers.